So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Lynn Moore.
Thank you, Connie. One guest who didn't stand up is Greg Otis, a good friend and family member, really, that he and I have had some great conversations about Richard Rohr and this particular book, as have Marvin Lee and me. Marvin and I helped lead classes at our other church, chapter by chapter in the book. So for those two and any of the others who have read Falling Upward or Second Mountain, don't let me get off track. Jump up and when I get something wrong or leave something out, make sure you get me straightened. I do appreciate this class very much. It's got a number of friends that I've had for a long time here. Love having some new friends that I've met. I'm sorry Keenan's not here. He's hopefully recovering well from his hip surgery. But he's the one that first keyed me into some of the talks and lured me here probably 2 years ago for Mike Moore's presentation, some things. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate very much my daughter, Kristen, and her husband, Kevin, and my wife being here. It's kind of a funky title to the talk, and what I'm trying to do in that is get one of my favorite scriptures, Micah 6:8, incorporated into the message that both these authors have to offer, and that is how we walk humbly with our God. Justice is one thing we can talk about forever. Mercy is another thing. In fact, a lot of translations, it's instead of mercy, they'll use kindness or goodness or faithfulness. I like mercy better because I think it's a deeper concept, but that's a whole different discussion. So we're going to talk about walking humbly with our God. The two authors, the two books are Falling Upward. Has anybody else read these books? Either one of them? Great. Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, and the other one is The Second Mountain by David Brooks. They both pretty much deal with the same concept. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan Roman Catholic priest. He spent 14 years as a jail chaplain, and then in 1987 he founded the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he has really developed that into a place where there are conferences, books are written. He's written a number of books. They have podcasts and daily meditations, all sorts of resources. There have been other people who have been involved with that. Brian McLaren, recently deceased Dr. Barbara Holmes, Reverend Dr. Cynthia Bourget, and Dr. James Finley. And some of the other books that Richard Rohr has written is Breathing Underwater, which is about the 12-step program, Jesus' Alternative Plan, which is about the Sermon on the Mount, The Universal Christ, which kind of takes the theme that we get in the prologue of John about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and then the Word became flesh. So he kind of takes that concept and builds it out, and it's a great book. He's got a new book out called The Tears of Things, which is about the wisdom of the prophets. He says in his early years, he was a very conservative, pre-Vatican II Roman Catholic, living in innocent Kansas, pious and law-abiding, buffered and bounded by his parents' stable marriage and many lovely liturgical traditions that sanctified his time and space. He emphasized he had a very happy childhood. But he grew in experience and education and became what he says, simultaneously very traditional and very progressive. He says, I no longer fit in with either the mere liberals or the mere conservatives. He is a person of paradox, and he believes that paradox is present in so many aspects of faith and religion. And his comment is he still believes in the divine creation, but he harbors a creative doubt that keeps him in a perpetual beginner's mind. He says, at this stage, I no longer have to prove that that I or my group is the best, that my ethnicity is superior, that my religion is the only one that God loves, or that my role and place in society deserves superior treatment. And David Brooks, I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of him. He's a columnist for the New York Times. He's a commentator on PBS, on NBC, pretty active and pretty visible. He says that when he was first in college, he was a liberal Marxist. He read and was first repulsed by the book by Edmund Burke called Reflections on the French Revolution, because Edmund Burke is really a conservative. He then got a job with William F. Buckley Jr., having made a pretty facetious comment one time in the paper when Buckley was coming to give a talk. And he said, well, really, I was just asking for a job. Well, Buckley thought it was very funny, so he offered him a job, and David took it. And he worked for the National Review for a number of years. So now he really is considered to be more of a conservative. He wrote one book called Road to Character, and another one called How to Know a Person, the Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. He's got a very interesting spiritual background. It's discussed in the book, but it's also, he had an op-ed in the New York Times this past December in which he talked about it. He was raised also a very happy childhood. He loved his childhood, but he was Jewish. And he came from a very observant Jewish household. And he loved their tradition and the culture, but he was agnostic. You know, how often do we hear that phrase these days of, well, I'm spiritual but not religious? Well, his comment is, I was religious but not spiritual. He went to a Christian camp, went to a Christian school, sang the hymns joyfully but without conviction. But his Christian faith came upon him based on some experiences he had and exposure to places and times when he felt in the presence of something overwhelming or mysterious. Time is suspended, or at least blurs. One is enveloped by an enormous bliss. And he's talking about times when he was with the Scheurich Cathedral, an emotional experience he had in the subway with thousands of people around him. He starts thinking, well, each one of these is a separate person with an individual soul and their own story. And then he hiked up to American Lake near Aspen to read some poetry, and in the process, a little badger comes up to him, and he said, finally, this feeling that there is something much greater than I am came over him, and he walked the mile and a half back down to his lodge with a great joy. He refers to himself as an amphibian, living half in water and half in land, a border stalker, perpetually on the line between different worlds, politically not quite left, not quite right. And I think he really bears his heart in the book where he talks about the difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is when you have a personal pleasure or fun or something exciting. Joy is the feeling you get when you do something for somebody else. And you think that's a much deeper feeling. I give a lot of quotes from the books or use the language of the authors a fair amount because I think that's essential to get their message across in the way that really has impacted me and hopefully does a much better job than I could do telling these concepts on my own. The book was released in 2011 and was updated this past year in 2024. And in the update, there's a foreword by Brene Brown, who has been in the news quite a bit within the last couple of years with some of the books that she's written. And then he added what he calls an afterword, which is the opposite of the foreword at the end that he wrote in 2023. And the main theme of the book is to describe how we move from our first half of life, which is building our personal identity, to the second half of life when we're able to develop our place in the broader union with God, which is our true selves, and live beyond the first half dualistic win-lose, us-them episodes of our material world. And he refers to that as our false self. David Brooks' book, Second Mountain, was released in 2019, and he states as his purpose to show how individuals move from the first to the second mountain, to show what kind of deeper and more joyful life looks like step by step and in concrete detail. Everybody says you should serve a cause larger than yourself, but nobody tells you how. This is ultimately a book about renewal, how things that are divided and alienated can become new wholeness. He feels as though our society is suffering from a crisis of connection, a crisis of solidarity, and we live in a culture of hyper-individualism. There's always tension between the self and the society, between the individual and the group. And he thinks that over the last 60 years, we've swung too far towards the self. And the only way out is to rebalance, to build a culture that steers people towards relation, community, and commitment, the things we most deeply yearn for, yet we undermine with our hyper-individualistic way of life. And I know some of you were at the talk given several weeks ago at the Knippa Lectures by Dr. Jonathan Walton, of the president of Princeton Theological Seminary. His topic was hyper-individualism. It was titled, "What Do We Owe One Another?" But he gave some great stories and gave a beautiful talk about how we are too far into the hyper-individualism. Rohr's metaphor is first half of life, second half of life. Brooks's metaphor is first mountain, second mountain. And the first stage is formation of our personal identity. Those are the books. Those are the bios. I'm slow on getting my slides up here. I apologize for that. So Richard Rohr has several metaphors he used. One is leaving home. He considers the soul we're born with to be home. And then as we grow and become independent, we have to leave that home. And he says building our container, who we are, how we are identified. And he also uses the phrase loyal soldier. And that's a metaphor that he kind of works back into this. It's a metaphor for moving into the second half of life. And it's based upon this report that was done by William Plotkin about Japanese soldiers who were returning to Japan after World War II. And, you know, the reputation of the Japanese soldiers is they were so focused, so committed. He said that there was a ceremony that they went through in which they praised the soldiers for their commitment and the work they did and whom they are. But then they said, okay, the war is over. You're now to come back and be a constructive part of this society. And it's called discharging your loyal soldier. So it's when you break away from that first half of life identity and move into the second half. He calls that discharging the loyal soldier. Brooks says that establishing our personal identity, we are all about managing our personal reputation. And the second stage is a higher consciousness and purpose. And this is how we relate to one another in the broader community. Rohr's book kind of describes a state of being, as where in Brooks' book, he really it's more of a plan of action. He gives more specifics about where to go, how to get there, and he gives a lot of stories about people that he believes are good examples of that. But they both agree that to get from first stage to second stage, there's generally a chasm, a valley, a period of suffering or loss, a period of futileness. So that's the thing that I think catches a lot of people off guard a little bit, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. As I said, Rohr believes that every person is born with an innate soul, which he calls our personal home. To function in the world, it's necessary that we move away from that home to construct our personal identity. We want to establish an identity separate from our parents and to make our mark in the world. It includes obtaining our education, cultivating our talents, pursuing a job or career, achieving financial stability, and the accumulation of stuff, and establishing a home and growing a family. And in working towards these goals and objectives, we're building and relying upon a secure ego, establishing personal boundaries and rules. And he says often we have to bump up against the rules and boundaries to fully develop our own personal container or self-identification. Our ego wants to know, how do I measure up? Where do I rank? And our goals are reflective of what the culture endorses, which is to be a success, be well thought of, become a part of the right social circles, to have nice stuff, to be a part of a good Sunday school class. Once we have constructed our container, established rules and boundaries, and individual identity can be hard to leave. They become our comfort zone and feel a bit like a form of salvation. I think we all have a little bit of Pharisee in us. We like to know what the rules are, and we like to know whether we're complying with those rules, how we're faring. But that's staying within the first stage, ego-driven. He says we're all hardwired by our culture to go through this first stage. The first container stays with you and helps guide you through the second half. In other words, that first container is always there and marks you in your experience as you go into the second half, and you always have that first half to rely upon as you move forward. In the first half of life, we're our false self. The false self is our role, title, and personal image that is largely a creation of our own mind and attachments. At this stage, winning and losing, judging good from bad, us from them, they're all part of our being. This process is ego-driven. As the psychologist James Hollis puts it, your ego certainly prefers certainty to uncertainty, predictability over surprise, clarity over ambiguity, Your ego always wants to shroud over the barely audible murmurs of the heart. The ego, says Lee Hardy, wants you to choose a job and a life that you can use as a magic wand to impress others. The ego wants you to point your life to the role that will make you seem smart, good-looking, and admirable. And most of us have spent a lot of time trying to conform to this ego ideal. And Brooks says he has no principled objection to the first mountain, but he believes our socio-cultural norms are deeply skewed toward first mountain projects and goals. And it wouldn't be bad if they were supplemented by a culture that attends to the value of relinquishing self to the other. However, that's often not the direction our ego wants to take us. Brooks is disturbed by the current moral ethos of American life that emphasizes individual subjective freedom at the expense of community, family, and marriage. The I'm free to be myself ecology promotes a hyper-individualistic society, which promotes consumerism at the expense of genuine human intimacy. These drowned out higher truths embedded in the second mountain culture, which are the relationality and love. And some great scriptural metaphors for the first half of life people are the loyal older son in the story of the prodigal son. He obeyed all the rules, and he was really ticked when he didn't get the recognition that his younger brother got. And then the Pharisee in the story with the tax collector, where he thanked God that he was not a sinner. He was always complying with the rules. And then also the rich man who had asked Jesus, how do I get eternal life? And the rich man he obeyed all those commandments, every one of them. And then he was really depressed when Jesus told him, well, you need to go sell all that's your personal identity, your wealth, and give it to the poor. They all followed the rules strictly and believed they had done what was asked of them, and they were all disappointed where they were not given the recognition they thought they earned. And Rohr says that a first stage person is what the modern church often encourages us to be. He thinks the church misses the point in this regard. He says, if this stage makes us feel comfortable and secure, we may mistake it for the true voice of God. The loyal soldier is the voice of all our early authority figures. The first half of life solidifies the ego and creates a stalwart, loyal soldier. However, there's a deeper voice of God, which we learn to hear and obey in the second half. Life is never a straight line forward. It's constantly filled with loss and renewal, order, disorder, and reorder, death and resurrection, chaos and healing at the same time. Truth is primarily about reconciling these contradictions. He said, sooner or later, if you are on any classic spiritual schedule, some event, person, death, idea, or relationship will enter your life that you simply cannot deal with using your present skill set, your acquired knowledge, or your strong willpower. And you will and you must lose something. This is the only way that the life, fate, God, grace, mystery can get you to change, to let go of your egocentric preoccupations and go on the further and larger journeys. Sometimes this is simply reaching the top of the first stage and feeling unfulfilled. Failure and humiliation force us to look where we never would otherwise. And it's not enough just to read about failing or falling. If we think we can engineer this on our own, we're deceiving ourselves, because it will fail because it's mainly ego-driven. This is the death and resurrection valley that is necessary to reach the second stage. Both authors agree that we should not leave our sin or suffering until we learn what they have to teach us. Brooks says, understand that your suffering is a task. If handled correctly, with the help of others, will lead to enlargement, not diminishment. From our point of suffering and loss, we see that the ego is of help no longer. Brooks says the valley is where we shed the old self so the new self can emerge. There are no shortcuts. They're just the same eternal three-step process that the poets have described from time eternal, from suffering to wisdom to service. Dying to the old self, cleansing in the emptiness, resurrecting in the new, going from the agony of the valley to the purgation of the desert, to the inside on the mountaintop. It is from the valley that we begin our trek up the second mountain and start experiencing the second half of life. Most of us tend to think of the second half of life as largely getting old, dealing with health issues, letting go of our physical life. But the whole thesis of his book is exactly the opposite. What looks like falling can be experienced as falling upward or onward, hence his title, Falling Upward, into a broader and deeper world where the soul has found its fullness, is finally connected to the whole, and lives inside the big picture. And he uses the term unified field for this big picture a number of times. He says our frame should grow larger as we move toward the big picture, in which one God creates all and loves all. Both Red Sox and Yankees, blacks and whites, Palestinians and Jews, Americans and Afghans. The trouble is that a lot of people don't get there. We're often so attached to our frame, game, or raft, it becomes a substitute for objective truth, because it's all we have. Inside such entrapment, most people do not see things as they are. They see things as they, the people, are. Some seem perfectly satisfied with their first mountain, ego-driven position, and some may not be willing to do the inner analysis and reflection it generally takes to move beyond it. And Rohr says, in my experience, this is most of the world. He says to get to that second stage, we need to do our inner work, inner analysis, to reach that point of wisdom and non-dualistic thinking. Rohr says that through the centuries of meticulous and utterly honest self-observation, Buddhism has helped people see this in themselves probably better than most of the other world religions. He says Jesus saw it, but we did not see him very well. So this is a journey back home, back to that soul that we were given when we were first born. He says your true self is who you objectively are from the beginning in the mind and heart of God. And this, to me, I watched on the video of Jennifer Clark, the hospice doctor, several weeks ago, talking about people in their final stages of life, knowing the transition is coming, having this feeling of being home, moving towards home. And Dr. Clark said, well, you will call that soul. He says, I call that consciousness. In the foreword that I mentioned before, written by Brene Brown, she talks about the homesickness of she experiences in spite of her recent fame and attention. She says, spiritual homesickness is a constant in my life. It was not an everyday occurrence, but a predictable and always recurring desperation to find a sense of sacredness within me, not outside of me. My soul, my home, God in me. It was homesickness that exists only inside me. So from the beginning, we're created with an inner drive and necessity that send all of us looking for our true self, whether we know it or not. This is a spiral journey, not a straight line. He says it's religion's job to teach us and guide us on this journey to discover our true self. But it usually makes the mistake, religion does, of turning this into a worthiness contest of some sort, a private performance, or through our belonging to the right group, practicing the right rituals, or believing the right things. He says these things are all just tugboats to get us away from the shore and out into the sea. Only the true self knows that heaven is now and that its loss is hell now. The false self makes religion the old evacuation plan to heaven, as Brian McLaren calls it. And these are the characteristics of the second half of life. I don't know whether you can read those well enough, or should I read those?
You need to read them.
Okay, good. Part of the process we're learning to deal with is our shadow selves. Our shadow self is that part of us that we refuse to see or don't want others to see. And it takes critical self-evaluation for us to uncover it in ourselves. Rohr calls this shadow boxing. He says shadow boxing can be helped by mirroring by a wise person or elder. In the second half of life, we gradually step out of the revolving hall of self-reflecting mirrors, but we need at least one true mirror of ourselves, an honest friend or partner to ground us, who reveals our inner, deepest, and divine image. He says we can't mirror ourselves. That's a first half of life illusion. We really do find ourselves through another's eyes. He says the transition from the first half to the second half can happen multiple times, or it could be one big transition. More often than not, it's many little moments of enlightenment. I know I think back on a number of incidents that I think, I'm doing the wrong thing, I need to get straightened out. And
so we can be in both halves at the same time?
I think we are always have that first half with us. It's always there. And we need to move to the second half. We have this tendency, if we're not doing the right shadow boxing, or shadow boxing in the right way, dealing with ourselves critically, then we can lapse back into that and let that ego come out and start asserting itself.
Okay. So it's not age, we tend to think, you divide your age by half.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. So in his book, Brooks presents his view of the specifics of the first mountain and the second mountain in much greater detail and depth, and from a practical life experience. And as I said, he gives lots of stories about people and so forth. And these are some of his things he talks about as how to achieve that second mountain. I guess you can read that okay, huh? He says the differences between first mountain and second mountain people. Perhaps the most fundamental one is the the first mountain people, worship at the altar of their own will, which can be voracious and narcissistic. The second mountain persons place their will in a participatory relationship with the will of God, acting on behalf of and in response to that higher calling. In a sense, a person with enough willpower, craft, and luck can dominate the first mountain. The second mountain, though, is an infinite task, one that will never reach completion. You conquer the first mountain through your ambition, strategy, and independence. You are conquered by the second mountain when you become relational, intimate, and relentless. Motivations are strong in each case, but very different. The first mountain person is oriented towards the fulfillment of an autonomously selected, ego-driven goal. The second mountain person is oriented to the other, whether it be God, a vocation, a community, etc., and it strives beyond the acquisition of any particular goal. And then Brooks spends a lot of time talking about what it means to reach that second mountain in your vocation, which is, he compares it to a career. The career is that you train for and you think you can make a good living doing that. A vocation is something that you are called to. My daughter is a hospice nurse, and I know the calling that she has. She works her butt off, but she has this drive to keep doing it. Then also in marriage, to reach that second mountain of marriage, you have to have a desire and a commitment to give more to the union and to the partner than what is expected. And then on faith or philosophy, he really recounts his first mountain to second mountain movements in his political philosophy, from liberal Marxist to Burkean conservative, and his faith from agnostic cultural Jew to committed Christian, in each case being mindful of and influenced by the road he has taken. And then the community, he advocates creating a culture of care and compassion in which all are focused on the common good. And at the end of his book, he concludes with what he calls the Relationist Manifesto. It's a summary of deeply moral and spiritual way of life that, on both an individual and a community level, can reweave our tattered world. Hyper-individualism leads to a competitive ego drive, to self-worthiness, and ultimately to tribalism based on mutual distrust. He argues for relationalism that operates by a logic that is the reverse of hyper-individualism. We possess only what we give. We lose ourselves to find ourselves, and we surrender to something greater. That is when we are the strongest and most powerful. Sounds a little bit like Paul saying, when I am weak, I am strong. So to conclude, when two persons this wise and deeply spiritual present these pictures as they are and their thoughts, yet one claiming he harbors creative doubt with a beginner's mind, and the other saying he's a border stalker or an amphibian. To me, it provides a wonderful example of what it means to walk humbly with God. Sorry, that's all I got. That's all I got.